Thank you, everybody, for coming in this evening. It is a great pleasure to welcome back to the Architectural Association Bernard Tschumi, someone who knows this lectern and this room extremely well, and for 40 years has been not only a vital member of the association, but also, of course, a renowned teacher, educator, architect, provocateur, and who has done work in this room and, in fact, many other rooms at the A that I think most of you in the audience will know very well. We're inviting Bernard back in part to celebrate the publication of a most recent book of his works, Thoughts, Life, and Career. Red is Not a Color. I'm quoting and not describing the book. The subtitle of a book titled Architecture Concepts, which Bernard will present in part this evening, in which he will be tracing through the relationship between some of the recent projects, buildings, and other thoughts in relation to work that he's been doing for many years in his studio and as an educator in architecture. I had an opportunity, like many AA students here, to first encounter him in a student crit. I was in the middle of the 1980s meticulously tracing Mises' Barcelona Pavilion to try and hand in as a fifth-year project. And Bernard was invited in by my unit master, Peter Cook, to comment on the work about this time of the year. And in looking at a wall full of grids, the first thing Bernard did was pick up a box of pins, push pins that were in the soft room, and throw them on the floor and say, that's about as orderly as anything Mies ever did. And in that, tried to do what he's done so brilliantly so long for so many students and architects, is to try and make us think differently about what it is we assume to be order in architecture. The title of this book, Architecture Concepts, is something that he introduces as a way to try and work through the extent to which architecture today really can be a form of knowledge, and not, as he says in his opening preface, simply a discipline that wants to know about form. To see architecture as a cultural project is a way to summarize the many different facets of what Bernard has been doing, not only in his studio, but as a teacher for many, many years. It was, at its beginning, an incredibly provocative position to take, to see architecture at that point in late modernism as something that sits within a larger creative and cultural field of knowledge. And it's most certainly something that he used to shape what many of you will know was an iconic prototype idea of what a design unit can be here at the Architectural Association. And I'll say something on that in a minute. Bernard embodies, I think, an incredibly unique point of view within architecture today, someone who believes we really can and will continue to learn from what other creative minds do in other fields, like performance, like art, like choreography, like filmmaking, but that we look at that work from the eyes of an architect. And rather than simply do that work, look at how it might make us think about doing architecture differently. It's certainly a hallmark of what he and his students did here at the school in the unit that he was running. He is the literal embodiment of the generation of 1968, and in fact was in Paris in 1968 working for renowned modernist architects at a time in which the world rather violently changed. And he literally went from that space and street to the Architectural Association, I think perhaps via the encouragement of Cedric Price, another example of Cedric shaping what architecture became, and came here at, of course, an incredibly interesting moment in which the relatively stable modernist idea that a school is quite rigidly structured could in fact break open to become something that we know still today, which is a school driven by very unique, very distinctive agendas, aims, and ideas that we think of as units. And that's something that he put in place in Diploma Unit 10 in about 1973. And for those of you that don't know, one of the first things Bernard asked his students to do was to make a magazine and not a building, to challenge even schools like this in really unexpected ways. And the two chronicles that are produced, I think, are still an incredible record of what was happening in architecture at that time. Bernard left here as a unit master, established a practice in New York in the 1980s, and in looking back now, wins what's probably one of the defining projects of the latter half of the 20th century, which is the competition for La Villette Parc. Begins work on that, and soon after assumes the deanship at Columbia University, and really, and I really believe this to be the case, takes architectural education into the 21st century in ways that many of us would still look look to measure ourselves in relation to. Created ideas like paperless design studios, accepted the experimental potential of new design technologies quite openly, and of course brought lessons that were learned here to New York and the States in ways that really dramatically changed architecture there. So enough of an introduction here. I thought for Bernard's sake I would offer a short quote that he wrote in the 1970s here in describing a unit. The object of this unit is to develop experimental and polemical schemes. It is deeply suspicious of the notion that architecture of cities can be improved by finding a formula for progress. It rejects as arrogant the idea of enlightenment, and this is a unit that will be taught through lectures and seminars as much as tutorials around projects. I think it set a model for many of us to try and live up to. As I say, it produced a couple of remarkable records of its time, and it's an absolute delight to welcome you back here to a home. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, Brett, it is like home in many ways. And do you hear me well? Is it all right? Yes? Okay. And much of what I'm going to talk about tonight, it's really all your fault. And so what happened at the AA throughout these years, and it extends until today, it's really the art of asking questions rather than providing answers. And as long as we do that, I think there's some hope that architecture will be very much one of the liveliest activity you can think of. And maybe the first question to ask is, but what is architecture? And probably, I'll just follow up before talking about, this evening lecture. One of the most extraordinary thing about the AA at that early time that you mentioned is that the AA was probably the only school where students were not taught things that the faculty already knew. In other words, the student having to provide the correct answer to a question that had a formulaic, response. But rather to set the question themselves, to write the programs themselves. And that was quite extraordinary, considering that most other places were really places which had all the answers. So if you have the answers, please leave the room now. That's not what I'm going to talk about. Why do you write a book at one moment, where something that you have delayed for many, many years? You have delayed it because you don't want to do another monograph, you don't want to do another sort of promotional brochure on what the office does, but really you're trying to figure out what is architecture, or rather what are the basics, what are the what makes it that important discipline, or if you don't want to call it a discipline, what makes it such an important human activity. Amusingly enough, the word concept came very, very early in the whole making of the book, because the idea was that, by the way, originally the color red was also an issue. That was the alternative cover. I showed it to you just to amuse you. The publisher refused it because they said it'll never sell. They want images on the cover. But it's about saying that, after all, the color red is not about being a color. It's about being an idea. And because architecture is not about form, architecture is not about knowledge. It is about knowledge. It's not about form. It is not about perception. It is not even only about sensation, but really it is about concept and ideas. And so the starting point, which very, very clearly, and probably I'll read it, I'll be boring and I'll read it for you, simply to make the point that it's underlying in our day and age of iconism, this underlines the whole conversation. In the history of world culture, the word architecture is usually associated with building of great beauty and magnitude. Architecture is presented as the mere knowledge of form, yet it could be argued that architecture is first and foremost a form of knowledge, much like mathematics, philosophy, or art. One of the most important functions is to generate ideas and concepts around the world about the world we live in. Architecture allows us to apprehend that world, and it equally about asking questions and providing answers to problems of use or social activity. Nevertheless, architecture's inescapable materiality is what makes it different from philosophy, mathematics, and literature, yet by its very nature, architecture involves the materialization of concepts. So, if you ask yourself, what is architecture? And if you ask yourself this without wanting to resort on all the dictionary of received ideas, all the cliches, which existed long before you, you immediately, sort of start to wonder whether, yes, you've watched architecture in photographs, on film, on TV or so. And as a student, in the most classical manner, you have, of course, learned about the Villa Savoie and about the domino principle and so on. But somehow it seems all very static and quite different from the experience that you really have about architecture. About that. That's, by the way, that's my thesis. It's very influenced by Cedric, by the way. You are living also in a period when it's a period of questioning. And I would say today we are also in such an era, a period of transition. At the time, of course, 68, the World Trade Center, which is a fantastic twin towers, but at the same time absolutely hated by the critics. A number of publications are coming out which are also raising a whole series of questions about what is philosophy, what is humanism, and names like Deleuze or Barthes or Derrida or Marcuse and so on are challenging these received ideas in exactly the same way as the art scene is challenging a certain number of visual practices. Say Henry Moore or Anthony Caro are universally disliked. I find it quite amusing today, since these provide inspiration in our iconic era. So the art scene wants to replace it by a critique and use conceptual art, use a series of pieces of work which try to challenge the idea of art to start with. Movement, however, the movement of bodies in space, the rediscovery of the body is actually something which is okay. It cannot be sold and bought. It's not part of the marketplace. And whether it is the early 20th century of the Bauhaus with Schlemmer or many of the other performance artwork, quite an interesting phenomena happens is that maybe a certain way to define what you do can be through the body on one hand and through concept and ideas. Film is probably far more important then, and I'm talking about the 70s, than it is today. A whole generation, if you think of Nouvelle, if you think of Colas or myself and a few others, really learn everything they know about film. From the Russian constructivist avant-garde cinema to Wim Wenders, or before Godard and so on. Many issues are fascinating because it is about a space, a filmic space, but where the space is as much a protagonist as the actors themselves. If you say that space is a protagonist, you may ask yourself what is the mode of notation that you're going to use. And we architects depend enormously on the mode of notation we use. Someone who used to teach here, Robin Evans, once famously wrote, "We architects do not build, we draw." And although that was true only, starting in the 17th century, before that we were on the building site, the idea of drawing axonometrical perspectives has actually certain limitation. It doesn't talk about movement, it doesn't talk about the body, it doesn't talk about smell, it doesn't talk about sound. It's a very, very limited device. Now, suddenly you discover in a publication about avant-garde filmmaking in the 20s, someone who is actually trying to notate a way to say, to describe at the same time the movement of the camera, the sound of the film score, the discussion or whatever movement of the various actors. And in other words, suddenly you realize that there are certain modes of notation that have a lot to do about a far more complex and sort of experimentation about what architecture is. And then movement being what it is, you learn a lot from film. I'm not going to go into details, whether it is expressionist cinema or futurist or whatever. Look simply at the building on the top right of the left page. The Carpenter Center is a fascinating building because you realize there's a ramp that intersects with the building, somehow misses it, doesn't quite work. And buildings that do not quite work are always interesting because sometimes they keep asking the question. They do not fill all the resolution. So in other words, we're talking about things which are not there stuck in stone. Look at the dancer on the right. It's not at all someone who is dancing in the perfect white space of the gallery's environment. On the contrary, it's starting to use the surrounding, call it the context or call it whatever. In other words, the protagonist of the dance are the chimney tops, the water towers, etc. In other words, it defines a form of architecture which is just as much about the movement of the body in space as it is about what surrounds it. In other words, there is not, and this is, I coined a phrase that was going here in the unit at the time, there is no space without something that happens in it. This is not the same on the left or on the right. And of course, it has that materiality, you know, however conceptual you may be, at one moment you refer to the materiality of what you are dealing with. Architecture is built, it's not like mathematics. And I've always been fascinated by this mosque in Djenné, in Mali, where you have every year to rebuild part of the mosque with the whole 8,000 inhabitants of the village because of the rainy season. So in other words, it is simply architecture in action. So the question of architecture has to express itself in one way or another. And in our day and age of advertisements and of commercial, let's say, consumer society, it was tempting to ask yourself the following question: why don't we do advertisement for architecture, try to sell the idea of constraint, the idea of decay, the idea that architecture is never something that is a certainty, but on the contrary carries uncertainty, carries constraint, and you better like them, like on the image on the right. And these advertisements were put in a series of magazines. As imagine you're being asked to write an article and you tell the editor, yes, I'll do the article provided you let me put an ad in your thing. So question of spaces is really the starting point. The word space is important because the word space has no quality per se, as opposed to the word architecture. You can talk with artists and musicians when you use the word space. When you use the word architecture, you get in trouble, or you hear cliches like architecture is frozen music, and you hate to hear that. So you rather take the word space and, or possibly, say maybe let's not use the regular sort of programs And that was, again, and it's why I say, you know, so much of it happened in this building, when instead of giving a program, we started to suggest that, hey, how's about giving a novel? And taking a novel by Italo Calvino, or by Hermann Hesse, or by Edgar Allan Poe, and a few others, eventually ending with James Joyce, because James Joyce was really the epitome of complexity for some of us, so much so that I thought I have to do it myself, because I had no idea what the student could come up with. So this project became an important project at the beginning of the work, as you can recognize the first sort of hint of the point grid. The point grid was actually the Admiralty map, which was taken on Covent Garden, and each student had one of the intersections of the grid and as a location of their project. A first point grid work. And then the idea of those follies continued in New York as, strangely enough, as one starts to work and spends a lot of time with other disciplines, well, you talk to writers, you talk to artists, and eventually they return the favor and they ask you to do pieces. In that case, it used to be called site-specific sculptures, which is a pretty horrible, you know, name, but nevertheless was the opportunity for someone who is not an artist, but not quite an architect either, to do pieces of work which were built temporarily and which were beginning that experimentation. So you don't know how to call them. You call them follies because it gives a strange feeling of unreasonableness. They are unreasonable. You're still fascinating and fascinated by developing an argument. It's all about an argument. And by the way, the reason the book is constantly interspersed with certain text is that quite often when you use different media, if you use drawing, you can get certain answers or certain, you know, raise certain issues in a certain way. If you write about them, then something else happens. It becomes a different type of logic. The media is different. If you use a video, the media is again different. And every time you get closer to what you're looking for. So many in the book, many of these texts, and at the same time, trying to do architecture without starting with facades or with volumes or what architecture normally looks like in architectural magazine, meant that one had perhaps to look at other areas. In this case, film was, again, as I mentioned, something terribly important, taking the movement of the protagonist in a film and trying to trace them, trying to map them as a sort of choreography, and the choreography itself becomes the traces of an architecture to come. Without getting into details, it's all about the materialization of movements into architecture. You look for precedents. You have some, again, in architecture, whether they work or not. The Manhattan Transcripts are nothing but that continuation, is to say, how's about writing a B-movie or a detective novel, but trying to use a series of architectural devices and explore those architectural devices without having to rely on the prevalent world of ideas, the prevalent rather world of images, which you see in the magazines or in, you know, the prizes that the IBA gives or that the Pritzker gives that didn't exist. Well, yes, it did actually. In other words, something that was fairly predictable. So hence, the Manhattan Transcript were that form of exploration. For example, this drawing, which is 30 feet long, which is literally a walk through 42nd Street. The murderer has come out of jail, moves through the street, encounters, gets killed, etc. And it's a mode of exploration that has a narrative dimension, but the narrative dimension is not because you're interested in the storytelling, you're interested in the serial nature of architectural transformations in a way. But of course, as I said, you don't call it architecture. So whether it's the archetype of the park or the archetype of the street or the archetype of the tower, the fall in a tower, it's basically the attempt to develop a mode of notation. Again, the word notation is important. You have to invent your own mode of notation, otherwise you fall back. It's as if you were to write a novel using the style of somebody else. You better try, unless you are into a certain type of parody, you are into finding a voice of your own. And so the early question was all about space, event, and movement. And the Parc de la Villette, the story is very well known, was simply at the time the first competition that you've done all that research work that you have shown in art galleries, you have shown it in various publications or talks, and at one moment you say, that's enough, let's test it on somebody else's program, not a murder story anymore, not a detective story, let's try on somebody else's program. So the Parc de la Villette, the park is interesting because it can be anything. You know, it doesn't really have a definition, and you get a 500-page sort of program, but you can't do much with it. So you reinvent what it is using those concepts and ideas that were explored in the preceding years in a way which was totally free from any preconceived notions of what architecture was. So without getting into details, you do something that I still do today, which is immediately look at the different alternatives. You never come to an idea immediately. You may have an intuition, but in reality, you test different combination and permutations, and you do it in such a way that it opens a field, and maybe there you might either find what you're looking for or invent a new type or a new concept. The project is known, so I don't want to get into it. The superimposition of point, line, and surfaces is really what is the most important. In other words, it's not about individual follies. Who cares about follies? Really what is important is that you have three systems, three logics that are totally autonomous from one another, that you superimpose to one another, and they sometimes reinforce one another or they contradict one another, and it brings you something else. Now, the reason why I show those two images is that sometimes some competitions are extremely important as a way to be, how could you call that, stock taking of where architecture is. The image on the left is a drawing by someone who was also teaching here at the time. It's 1976 is Leon Creer. That was not the actual La Villette competition. It was prior to that. It was simply an idea competition. It was not for the real job. Leon did such an extraordinary piece of work that the several hundred young architects who did that competition were completely amazed. And that project had an incredible influence on a whole generation. And interestingly enough, so that you could call the historicist postmodern, generation. Interestingly enough, when in 1982-83 there was the new La Villette, a lot of people have written about, the rivalry between Rem Koolhaas and myself. Not so simple. In reality, the person I was really trying to beat was Leon Creer, who had done such an extraordinary project 6 years earlier and had defined, in a way, a generation. So at that time, the early 80s, there is something else which is happening, which is the beginning of and I don't want to use the word deconstruction, a way of dismantling some of the ideals or the certainties of the historicist period. Oops, I'm going the wrong way. But I don't deal to, amusingly enough, look, extraordinary drawings by Neil Porter, and a lot of names. As I had no office, the La Villette was done literally at the corner of a kitchen table, and I had no office when I wanted, and immediately called people at DA who were really good, and we tried to put it together without the slightest idea how you put a building, you know, on top. But that's interestingly enough, La Villette was very much about import and export between different disciplines. I had thought, let's have artists working with landscape architects and so on. And as you can see on the project on the bottom right, when I tried to marry Peter Eisenman and Jacques Derrida to do a garden together, that could be a lecture on its own. I'm sure Peter has done it. The project was not built for mostly going vastly over budget, but an interesting. So so I go a little further. Oops, and move on to other issues. The mode of notation is interesting because suddenly it allows you to explore other fields. Brett, 2 years ago, suggested, so probably most of you were not here yet, probably the most rainy day in London in generations, had the idea that we would do a remake of the fireworks here in Bedford Square. The firework worked, we were soaked, and tried to indeed do that three-dimensional way of space. Anyway, the point is, much of the discussion was, if you don't want to talk about form and about architecture as a series of iconic images, maybe you have to start about program. And this is an image which probably has haunted me ever since. What do you think it is? Is it a church? Is it a gym? Is it a voting place? It's all of the above, maybe. The fact that there is no cause and effect relationship between what happens in a space and the space itself is a fascinating notion. There's no functionalism in all that. It's sort of saying, yes, sure, you can have an ideal kitchen, right? Where everything is reinforcing everything else. But you can have things which are totally contradictory and conflictual, like playing hockey in the living room, etc., or indifferent. Or you use displacement, like the early avant-garde and, say, Marcel Duchamp, or even playing with typologies when the same architect, Frank Lloyd Wright, does a parking garage and then he does a museum with the same type. So this relativity is something that you get quite fascinated with, especially when you see certain precedents about quote context. This is I'll say because I think it's a very important experiment. It's called the Kuleshov experiment. It's a filmmaker in the 20s. Take the absolutely plain, unmoving face of the actor, and through montage puts right next to it a dead figure, a bowl of soup, or a very beautiful young woman, and ask the audience what you read in the face of the actor. Those on the left and on the right are two different versions of the same film. And of course, the audience says on the first one, the actor is sad. On the second one, they say he's hungry, and then they say he's full of lust. And in reality, you know that it's simply the juxtaposition of the two that makes it. If I make this space here in this room, if I turn it into a place which is a mini boxing rink, the nature of the architecture changes. So, and of course, cities are the most fascinating part of it, because as you can see, cities are by definition the place of that that series of conflicts and constraints. A building right on the right next to our office in New York, which has been used as a church, as a department, as a sort of second-hand clothing place, as a storage barn, and etc., etc., etc. So programmatic dissociation are really important, and you keep exploring this through a series of competitions. Competitions are very important at the time because a whole generation is testing ideas. The Tokyo Opera here, or the large library in Paris. You find the same people are all competing against one another. You competing even Zaha, Rem, Cedric, even at La Villette. It becomes a conversation that you have about those different pieces of work. Here, the running track that goes through the library. In other words, testing some of the concept in the competitions themselves. You always get second prize or third prize at that time. Even Kansai Airport against some of the largest firms in the world, talking about a linear city. Renzo wins, but you get a second prize, you get encouraged, you keep working, and eventually, of course, it strikes. Second project we did was an art center, a culture center, where there was an existing building, which you see here on the top left, which was quite extraordinary because it was really a ruin. It had been abandoned for 25 years, but it has these large interior spaces, a fantastic landscape of roofs, and instead of demolishing it, it had gotten its demolition permit. You say, hey, I'm going to keep it, I'm going to put a big roof over it, and then use it as a found object, not unlike what Marcel Duchamp does with the urinal in a museum, simply by decontextualizing it, turns it into something else, and then the space becomes not a composition, but becomes something that you have actually obtained through the result of a strategy. So the concept itself is what gives you the form, and not the other way around. The concept is the superimposition of the roof, the new roof, over the old roof. By the way, it was a comment on the whole of the, I would say that's a found space in a way, the result of the strategy. But what I wanted to show you, maybe I don't have that image, no, is that it was also the time of contextuality, where people had to do buildings that looked like their context. Here you say, no, it's all about dialogue and not about imitation of the context. So we've been talking about space, movement, events. We've been talking about program. And then slowly you realize that there is one thing you cannot escape, whether you like it or not. You've talked about movement, so vectors are already in the conversation. But somehow there is an issue which is called envelope. And while the word had become quite fashionable now, in reality, you look at the image on the right, there's somebody called Buckminster Fuller who was really, frankly, not hated by architects, but completely dismissed by them. He was not an architect. Think of the architectural scene in America. He would never be celebrated. Here, the people who liked Bucky were people like Rainer Banham or Cedric Price or Artie Graham, but these were not considered like architects, as architects either. But the idea of saying you talk about an envelope is quite fascinating, because it means it doesn't have really a facade. It doesn't have a roof. Look at the image on the left. You know, the Renaissance invented the facade. It didn't exist really before. The walls themselves were carrying the building, and that's what you saw. While the facade is an applique, something which is placed on top of it. and that suddenly is the place where you do architecture, quote, quote, composition and aesthetics and so on. So suddenly taking this differentiation, taking the facade out of the envelope was a very interesting and important moment. At the same time, the idea of vectors was something which, I'll get back to the vectors, but the glass house by Charot, the various glass houses by Mies and by Johnson, and I'll get back to that in a minute, the use of transparency were interesting questions that were asked because did it work? Was it facades or was it? And of course, vectors, that's clear. Now, so this third set of questions is, and as I mentioned starting, every one of those parts, the book is in 5 parts, is there to ask what is architecture, what are the things that are, you can call it basics or fundamentals, that you cannot avoid. What you have, just as you have to deal with gravity, you'd have to deal with movements. So a series of projects and experiments are made about taking very often a Duchampian attitude, making the movement vectors completely random, throwing them as a piece of string on the floor and saying these are going to be the ramps or so on. Or more recently, testing here in a project with someone who is also a graduate, Hugh Dutton, who I met through Peter Rice many years ago. We did this walkway, this bridge over the tracks together, trying to avoid any formal move, but rather using the forces of tension and compression to determine what the envelope would be. So if you want, it's simultaneously a vector and an envelope, with the particularity where you have maximum compression, you have maximum matter, therefore the building is nearly solid. However, at places where you have maximum tension, like in any bridge, then it becomes almost entirely transparent. So that issue of the nature of the envelope and the forces that deal with it, inevitably you ask yourself, how's about glass? And you're asked to do a small gallery, temporary gallery in a Dutch city in Groningen, and you say, now, Mies did a glass house, but was it really a glass house? After all, if I take the glass out of the Mies building, I still have a marble, floor, or travertine, or whatever it was, and I have a steel and concrete deck, and I have a structure. I still have a house. What about having glass that becomes the total thing? That is, if you take off the glass, then the building simply disappears. So the beam are made of glass. We're talking about something which was built now almost 25 years ago. The glass were made of, the beam and the column were made of glass, and therefore if you take them out, the building simply ceases to exist. And I could say that this was the real glass house. With all sorts of effects. Amusingly enough, the building is still now part of the Groningen Museum. They do a lot of performances and artist installation and so on in that building, which is slanted at an oblique, which means that at night you have a sense, the reflection on the glass have a disorienting effect on your body. So this issue of the envelope, of course, you keep exploring it. And now the point that you're trying to develop out of a book is, again, not a monograph, but seeing, just as with the other project, with any of the project in it, is how you take every one of the project in order to ask a question. And in this particular case, the question that was asked was, what is their relationship between the material of the envelope and what it does. So in this particular case, it is a very large concert hall, 7,000 seats, one of those things for rock music, popular music, political meetings and all that. The site is really along a highway, not terribly interesting. However, you have to deal with sort of putting these 7,000 people, keeping the rain out. You separate the two envelopes. You have one envelope in to put the people inside and another envelope to keep the rain out. The first one is made of concrete. The second one is made of steel. And in between, you have circulations. People themselves, so the outer one is just metal. The seats are not part of your argument, so you make them transparent, but it's nice because when people walk in, they sort of play with the light and all that. And so that's the first way to answer that question. But then people like it, the sound is good, you're being invited to another competition, you win that competition, and this time you are in a forest, a fantastic forest, 200 years old trees, and you say, hey, same program. What about then taking the same program, the same concept, same context, but then trying to change the material? And here, so the answer, or the let's say the investigation or experimentation was to say, let's make the outer envelope made of polycarbonate, transparent, translucent, the inner envelope made of wood, and then, of course, circulation in between. And the notion of the in-between that we saw with the Le Fresnoy, the big roof over the old roof, that nature of the in-between is also very important in all the project, but I won't talk about it today. So then you realize something quite interesting. By having changed the material, you have completely changed the perception of the building. The concept is the same, but the material is so different that the sensations are different as well. In other words, something happened by that very moment when you choose what materials you're going to do. So you experiment further for a watch factory where you say the concept itself will have to be made in terms of, say, 3 materials. Steel on the outside, this time wood as an inner lining, and then all circulation is going to be made of glass. So there is a way to, if I say that architecture is the materialization of a concept, then you conceptualize that materiality, or you materialize that concept. And the building itself is exactly this. In other words, an outer envelope in steel, an inner envelope in wood, and all major circulation of the building are simply translucent or transparent glass. The rigor of the demonstrations is interesting. In other words, it's a little bit like a mathematician who tried to demonstrate a proposition is as few lines, as few words as possible. In this particular case, is us trying to demonstrate it in as few material as possible. So you arrive then in this proposition that every project that one does as an architect has to have a concept. It has a context. We're not building in outer space. Even outer space would be a context of sorts. And it has to have a content, what we call program earlier on. And that's rather interesting because you're always stuck with these. And so you decide, what you are going to, how you're going to play with them. And you look at what other people did. Look at the example that we all know about Frank Gehry and Bilbao, and then the Disney concert hall. How many of you are able immediately to distinguish which one is Bilbao and which one is Disney? Huh? Not so easy, isn't it? Well, it has always existed. Look, the La Tourette Monastery and the Boston City Hall, or the Villa Rotonda by Palladio near Vicenza, and not very far from here in Chiswick, a Palladian villa. So these doubles, or these ways to discuss how a building gets its own character and influence through the circumstances in which, the conditions in which it takes place. Imagine now you are doing a competition, thinking there are very, very few, the likelihood you're going to win is very, very small. It's always very good to do this type of competition because you're quite relaxed about doing them. So you enter a competition to do a new building for the Acropolis Museum. You know that most museums, including the British Museum, not far from here, have looked like the Parthenon. Your site, by the way, is 300 feet from the Parthenon. So that's a first interesting challenge. How do you as an architect compete with the Parthenon? Can you do that? So you have here to be very, very, how can I say, arrogant. Then you have another particularity on the site, is that it's filled with ruins, archaeological remnants, and you're told you're not supposed to touch them. And thirdly, one of the key reasons to do that building is to convince the Brits, the people next door, to return the Elgin Barbel to the Greeks. So three conditions, one that has to do with the Acropolis up there, the second one which has to do with the marbles, and the third one which has to do with the archaeology. The concept itself then becomes a derivation, or is directly an expression of those particular constraints. In other words, a glass rectangle that houses the frieze, we'll come back to the frieze in a minute, which is entirely glazed, so you can see the frieze, the part which is in Athens at this time, and the Parthenon at the same time. The rest of the museum in between, and hovering above the archaeological remnants, a part of the building. So the building is actually a tripartite, just as a concept is tripartite. The building is in three parts. Amusingly enough, they're still digging, actually still now, as we have put the building on stilt. Today, they're still continuing the archaeological research underneath the building, which receives, 10,000 people a day. Materials are fantastically important. You don't want to have those beautiful marble sculptures from 2,500 years ago in front of a plaster wall with sheetrock. The building, your building, is made of concrete. You say the dialogue is going to be between the existing structure of the building, the concrete structure of your building. So you're going to try to develop a concrete which has the beauty and also potentially the ability to establish a dialogue with the sculpture in marble itself. So hence, you play with the materials of the building in order to work with the material of the sculptures themselves. Before I get back to this point, let me just show you something that explains why I've been so obsessed about this building, is that I mentioned earlier that 32-foot long drawing, part of the Manhattan Transcript. It is a frieze. The only way to look at this drawing is actually to walk along it. You can't see it all at once, just like the frieze, which is 160 meters long. You walk along it. Now, a filmmaker, Sergei Eisenstein, the man whose notation I showed earlier, you see a little reproduction on the top right, had been to Athens and wrote after that a fantastic text called Montage and Architecture, showing images of a famous architectural treatise by Choisy, and saying, hey, the Greeks, the ancient Greeks, invented montage because of the different angles and the juxtaposition of images, like in film. But the most fantastic thing, and I don't think anybody has ever pointed that out, this mode of notation that I've shown larger at the beginning was for a film called Alexander Nevsky. And I saw Alexander Nevsky only while I knew the notation, but I saw it only while building the building in Athens and being quite familiar with the frieze. And suddenly I see the film and I see that sequence, that battle sequence, shot in 1938 or 39, which is exactly following the Greek original classical frieze. In other words, import and export between cinema and sculpture, here being in full swing, seeing that here the filmmaker, now after having been influenced by sculpture in, etc., etc. Some beautiful images by Iwan Barn of the building itself, where the nature of the relationship between the marble and the raw concrete becomes absolutely fundamental. The concrete absorbs the light while the marble reflects it. So once again, it's about concept and material, conceptualizing a material, and here viewing the Parthenon while you're looking at the sculptures, which of course have to be protected and be indoor today because of pollution and various other reasons. The big glass rectangle is exactly oriented parallel to the Parthenon in order to have the same light quality. And you can see the city as well, as you can hear and you see the thing. And what is also interesting, but I probably don't have this image, is that the glass volume is slightly shifted in relationship to the to what's below. It's not a deconstructive. This deconstructivist move is simply that the street pattern of the old city was not the same as the direction of the temple, and I use that as a way to make the parallel to the temple itself. Superimposition can take a lot of forms, not only superimposition over ruins, but over existing building. We saw the superimposition in Le Fresnoy, the art center with the big roof. Here, a manifesto project for Factory 798. I'm sure those of you who have been in Beijing have been to Factory 798, a major cultural center in Beijing now, with a lot of factories that were meant to be demolished and destroyed. And going there one day, amusingly enough, I was there with Wolf Prince as we were talking about what to do about saving the place. And the idea was to say, what about simply superimposing, keeping the factories and putting the 10 million square feet or the 1 million square meters as a lattice, as a sort of, you may know Jonna Friedman, as a sort of spatial city flying or hovering over the existing building. There was a lot of press for that at the time, a lot of TV. The government decided not to demolish Factory 798, possibly as a result. So we never had to build anything. But I thought architecture can be also a manifesto and a way of thinking. And the most of it, of course, but I don't want to spend much time on the most horrifying experience probably of mine as an architect is to see the World Trade Center being demolished in front of our eyes, a few hundred meters away. I think we like building too much for that and trying to participate in the discourse and then realizing it's not about another icon, but it's really what is the literally the political and the social context of architecture. It's not about images, it's what the images do. And in this particular case, that project was really testing exactly like taking the Kuleshov effect. You remember the face of the actor in front of the bowl of soup, or the body in a casket. Here is taking the same tri-tower, you know, as the project, but placing it in 4, 5, 6 different contexts, from a memorial to Las Vegas or to a city of brotherhood. Hence, it is not the same building, and yet it is the same architecture. You can imagine repeating it to turning it as a multiple thing. And I arrive to the final thing. So you may have noticed that throughout all this time, one word was never used. Always trying to not to use it. In a way, there used to be a joke in the office. You know, there were 2 things that you could never use. A, the color green, and B, the word form. And so at one moment, you arrive in a situation where you're stuck having to confront those 2 words. Well, first of all, we live in an era, I would call it, we just ended the iconism era, right? You know, when everybody is trying to do those things on the right, that basically all try to compete with one another with a sign without any signification. But you realize that sometimes you're stuck with this type of situation if you don't have quite all the information. Look on those images on the left. If you're asked to design a city, cities are so complex, you have to take at one moment a shortcut. You have to make an assumption. You have to make a hypothesis. And at that moment, that hypothesis may have to do with a form. And that's really a little problematic, because that form is the same as a concept. In other words, what I would call a concept form. And you see it throughout history, concentric cities, or the point grid of Le Corbusier, that had certainly an influence on us when we did the point grid at La Villette, and various other examples. So a concept form is what it's an abstraction that will then be made more figurative or more, let's say, contextual when you develop the scheme. Now, let me play a second with those 2 words, context and concept. When I showed the museum in Athens, you had a very complicated context. So we would take the context and then try to make it into a concept, i.e. conceptualizing the context. But sometimes you do exactly the opposite. You have to take a concept and then to contextualize it. So here, we were asked to do a new city, 40,000 inhabitants, in that green area, all that color that I don't like. Nobody had ever built anything there, you know, absolutely, Dominican Republic, no precedent. So of course you say, haha, here we are, Brasilia, let's do our new city. But it's not tabula rasa, it's all that green stuff. This green stuff, you say, hey, it's trees, it's nature. And you start to carve in the context. You carve a series of forms. They could have been squares, they could have been circles, they could have been triangles, they could have been blobs. In this case, we made the assumptions, let's take ellipses, call it elliptic city, that will be fine, double entendre and all this sort of thing. We carve a series of spaces within the context. So this abstraction means that the way to approach it is through that concept form. This is only one small part of the project. The project is about 6 kilometers by 4 kilometers. This is only the business center. It's about what I could call a reverse archipelago. It's not about preserving certain parts at the expense of others. It's simply carving a series of islands into the space and then developing the buildings like a series of smaller versions of the same within it. In other words, the vocabulary is constantly based on those circles or ellipses and so on. So the notion of the concept form is some things that you could call in the mathematics a parameter. In other words, you use it to get to the solution, but you don't have to keep it afterwards, or you keep it, but it's entirely transformed. Such as this building that we completed last year for a museum in Burgundy, a small sort of interpretation center where sure 360 view was needed to see all the hills. It celebrates the battle between Julius Caesar and the Gauls 2,000 years ago, and does it in a absolutely beautiful landscape, practically untouched. So the idea was to try to have, again now playing concept, material, and the circular 360 degrees movement route or vector, but doing it in, there are two buildings that are about half a mile apart. One is the museum, the other one is the interpretation center. One is made of wood, the other one is made of stone. While they have certain conceptual characteristics that are in common, others are different. And here, once again, you test that materiality. The two plans here, I'll leave that. Some aerial views of the first one, which has been completed a few months ago, the so-called Center for Interpretation with that double envelope. The double envelope is made of wood, and also as an attempt to make it literally disappear in the landscape. It absorbs the light. The outer envelope is made of those major big pieces of wood, while the inner envelope is made of black concrete or black glass, as you can see here. Certain views about how the two materials reinforce one another, and the interior is entirely made of concrete, the opposite game of having the glass ramps or glass circulation in the watch factory. Here it's all poured in place concrete, and some of the other views here. And eventually, if you ask about yourself about form, you can't resist to say, fuck form, let's do it formless. Currently under completion, a zoo, the Paris Zoo, just east of Paris, about 25 acres. And you say, what about having a form that has no form? And we architects, I hope all of you are fascinated by doing non-human architecture, architecture for, you know, giraffes and hippos and things of this sort. There are some fantastic precedents, right? Lubetkin with the penguins, but when we talked about that, the zookeeper said, "Oh, it was terrible. The penguins hated them." Or you have, of course, the extraordinary Cedric Aviary with Lord Snowdon here in London, or a little-known, absolutely wonderful project by John Haydock. It's his master's thesis. It's houses for animals, for the elephant, for the snake, for the monkeys. So these are your precedents, but of course you cannot use them. You are somewhere else. You are in another time. and you decide not to make architecture with the landscape as its background, but to make the landscape with architecture as its background, turn it the other way around. So the cages are for humans and for animals in the same way. The entrance area is like an aviary. Each of the little aviaries are either for architects, yes, sure, for visitors or for little monkeys, and large greenhouse, by the way, mostly done with incredibly low budget, with a very good general contractor, and then all the architecture is really about that non-form, that formlessness. The zoo is something very technical. You have to deal with major safety issues. You have to deal with major, it's like doing a hospital, a circus, a spectacle at the same time. And so the building are quite technical, but in front of them is again using the wood as that formless thing. And this is a year, yes, exactly a year from now, I think you will have the ability to go and discover it yourself. So it's all about, once again, it's all about architecture. It's not about form, but it's about ideas and concept. And philosophers have made an interesting distinction between the word concept, concept, percept, and affect. Now, concept, we've talked about it. Percept is about perceptions. It's about what you see. And affect, it's about emotion and experience. Very much in the last 10, 15 years, everybody's been talking only about perceptions and a little bit about emotions and about sensations, but very little about the concept. And so here is that discussion, that architecture cannot exist without the three terms. And so I'll read it again. Architecture invents concept and materializes them by turning them into physical spaces and constructed material. It is distinguished from other fields by the language it uses, concrete and glass, space and light, movement and programs, opposed to word and sentences, numbers and equations, melody and rhythm, and so on. What distinguishes a concept in architecture from a concept in philosophy is its implied materiality. So I could go on, give you further examples, but I think I'll take questions. Thank you very much.
Can we get a microphone? Maybe some questions? Thank you, Bernard. Thanks so much. Let me just open the floor right now. And as people are settling, having seen you present in many different settings and presenting your own work alongside some of the research, of course, the striking thing is how you're speaking, particularly in second person in this book. And I suppose that begs a question that maybe to open up this conversation would have to do with the relationship of your work in the studio to the making of this book versus other books that have been an incredibly important part of the project for many years. It seems to be a very different kind of book if for no other reason you're speaking about the work in a different tense. The pronoun itself, you, isn't the you out here. The you is you in the studio. And I'm just wondering if you could say something about what the production of this book was actually like compared to Event Cities, transcripts, and other texts.
All the other books, first of all, every book tried to avoid the monograph. I would say the monograph is the death of architectural thinking, right? So, but the other thing that you mentioned, say the first book, Architecture and Disjunction, was a series of texts, some written while being here at the AA, trying to, and indeed there is a sort of autobiographical part of it, but disguised in a way. Many of the texts were written at the time when one was trying, or I was trying to get away from being caught within the dictionary of received ideas of architecture. So those texts were trying to understand certain things based on certain readings and so on, but at one moment the text could not go any further, so you had to they were put together in a book called Architecture and Disjunction, which each of the texts used to be articles in various magazines, and then when I would write an article, I would write, the next article would be like the following chapter of the previous one, so it was very self-conscious, using the deadline of the article in order to get the chapters of the book, right, because I couldn't ever have done it otherwise. So that was a fairly straightforward mechanism, because it was an exploration without necessarily having done the work ahead of time. The second, the event cities are a very, imagine you have an office and you produce a lot of stuff, competitions and so on, and you can't bear the idea of having an archive, and you think the only way for me to find the stuff is if we do books in which we put it in, right? So the whole Event City series, of which there are 4 and a 5th one in the making, is a lazy way to not to have a proper archive. By now we've hired an archive person, and now we sort of have the thing, which, all right. But for a long time, and still now, you know, I'm so much faster to go into the one of them and look at it or point it out. So the event cities are a way simply to have your œuvre complète as you're doing it, but out of sheer laziness. The interesting thing, however, is that you want to give a theme to each of those event cities. And retroactively, you reconceive what you have already conceived. Amusingly enough, the five parts which I just showed you, 4 of them coincide with the 4 event cities, right? So it means that you discover either retroactively or while you're doing it, there's the correlation between certain themes you're interested in. So now let's get to this particular book. 776 pages, 1,500 words, 1,500 images, about 70,000 words or whatever. It took about, 6 years to do it. You can add 1 year in, just in production in China and this sort of thing. The point was to try to develop an argument. And amusingly enough, if the intuition about the issue of the idea and concept was there from the beginning, the text that sort of wrap it up is done at the very end. Once the book is done, then you say, hey, that was what it was all about. So the point is, and amusingly enough now, we're both in the, he runs this place fantastically well, by the way. Very influenced by the AA once upon a time. I ran the school at Columbia. When I ask a faculty member to describe what they're doing, I always ask them what they intend to their agenda. What do they want ever to be remembered for, right? That's exactly the question to answer in short. If I was to encapsulate an agenda, an argument, what would be that meta-argument? And the book was, in a sense, not one, even though there are a lot of projects about, us that we've done in various things in the office and so on. It's really a project, it's a project, yes, a project about architecture. It's a book about architecture. It's asking questions about architecture. In other words, it should not, that's why it's not a monograph at all. It's not about simply glossing over glossy images. It's really asking what architecture is, what are the foundations, what are, when I say you cannot avoid to have complex concept and content, or you cannot avoid having vectors and envelope, or you cannot avoid having space, event, and movements, is a way to ask the question, when you're doing a project, how does it fit within that general issue of what architecture is? The thing that has always fascinated me about architecture, as opposed to many other human activity, it's never fully defined. That's why I think that 2,000 years from now, it'll be still here if we still exist. It's probably one of the richest human activity because of that very fact. That's why you asked the question.
Thank you. Questions?
Hi, very interesting lecture. I don't know if I understand what you mean by concept. And I was wondering if that had to do with the idea of intention, with the idea of commitment, or with the idea of communication.
Sometimes any of these three. But I'm going to give you maybe several examples, right? The most basic one is one that we architects use a lot, right? Which is, say, when Le Corbusier invents what is called le plan libre, the fact that you have a structural grid, but that the actual partition can be moved in any possible direction, independently from the structure, it is a concept. The plan libre is a concept. When, say, Louis Kahn uses a distinction between servant spaces and serving and served spaces. He makes a distinction between two types of spaces and organizes buildings or even cities in that manner. This is a concept. Now, those are general concepts. Some of them are still valid today. You can see traces of them in some number of projects. If I look, you know, at the Toyo Ito Sana project, I will recognize certain, you know, precedents there. And then you have some, what I would call fundamental concepts, which really, without which the discipline could not exist. Here I'll use an analogy. If you are into psychoanalysis, there is no way to deal with psychoanalysis without the concept of the unconscious or the concept of transfer. In other words, if you take that concept out of psychoanalysis, you don't have psychoanalysis anymore, right? So you could ask yourself, what are, you know, the concept of architecture? I'm letting this question open because that's the whole point of this lecture, is that I want you to think about it. What they are.
Yeah, right here.
First of all, thank you for a lecture. So you set up a set of questions, but you've answered most of them. So my question to you, this will be funny, what's the next question you ask yourself?
I'm not sure if I fully heard the whole question. You said that I answered most of them?
Yeah, so...
Oh, no, far from it. Far from it. I would be desperate if I had, right?
Or you have an intuition of how to answer them?
Life would be really very, very dry without... No, I think the intent is to ask the questions and to provide one possible answer. Namely, there is never one single answer to any of these questions. However, asking the questions is sometimes quite important, right? And
Yeah,
that's
so that was my question. What's the next question?
What is the next question?
You ask yourself.
Well, I know what's the next, I'll tell you, the subtitle of the next event cities, right, is concept and material, which I talked a little bit about, but with project that I haven't shown you today, right? Or I'll give you another example. We're doing in all these, except when I showed this example of the Renaissance facade, I've never used the word facade. To my mind, I have never designed a facade. So I thought in this day now that I've done this big book, right, now maybe I'm ready to design a facade. And to look at also some precedents. So we're doing a project in Italy, and I thought, let's take two of the archetypes of Renaissance architecture, the facade, the fasciata, and the cortile. So the whole project is about 5 facades, 1, 4, 5, that are really plain and that have to deal with the issue of perforation. Well, facade is really how you make holes, right, in a wall, right, or how you replace it. So you ask yourself, what is the question that I still have not asked myself? And every new project is an excuse either to revisit a question or to invent a new question. That's probably the reason why, just now, between some of us here, why I always liked teaching. Because teaching was a very good excuse to ask a question to your students and work with them during a semester around it and discuss those. So that's how you do it. But the point that I wanted to add, it means that you always work with a critical distance. The word critical is very unpopular these days. It's not used at all. It's not even, the post-critical is gone. There's no more of that. We are the post-critical. But to have a bit of a distance in relationship to what you're doing yourself, right? That you don't do it purely in a vacuum.
For the back of the room, questions this side or over here? Anybody? Bernard, thank you for coming back. Great pleasure.
Thank you very much.